So today's video will be the trite old question, what is philosophy? But slightly distinguished from the question, what is philosophy about? Or what is philosophy for? Uh, I'm asking the question, what is philosophy, supposing that philosophy itself is a particular kind of subject matter. And I've said in past videos that in some sense one is already doing philosophy insofar, they're already doing philosophy tacitly insofar as one is asking, one is philosophizing, um, one is doing philosophy as soon as one asks what philosophy is. Um, but that is just an uninteresting answer. It doesn't really answer much because it's precisely this doing part that qualifies the activity as philosophical. We want to know what that qualification is, what that doing part is, so that we know what philosophy does, what its subject matter is, what is philosophy. And we want to know this. Just two things to say in advance about wanting to know this is that if there are such a thing as philosophers, when you ask them what the love of wisdom is, what philosophy is, they presumably should know, or this means that they don't know what their subject matter is, or they should be able to at least provide an answer of some sort that approximates or explicates that kind of subject matter. The other thing that I wanted to say was that the way that I want to go about questioning what is philosophy is to kind of show that the question itself can generate a content that sets provisions for answering. So ultimately, I'm not going to answer the question in any kind of final or total sense, but I'm going to build up the question as much as possible within this time that I have here, and leave off some loose threads, some ends to follow, maybe for you to follow, maybe for me to follow in future videos. But I just want this to be a kind of expose on being able to generate a content out of a question without having to appeal to externals or just kind of ad hoc provisions. We can understand what philosophy is right out of understanding the phrase that it implies, the love of wisdom. If we unpack that phrase, we can understand what philosophy is without having to understand anything outside of that phrase, is what I'm claiming here. So the etymology, like I suggested, like I mentioned, is the love of wisdom. Is this etymology intelligible? So we can only kind of continue on if we have a sense of meaning for these terms. Love of wisdom, love directed toward wisdom in some sense. Do we find the conjunction of these terms intelligible, such that loving something like wisdom is a possible activity that qualifies this doing part of what makes our activity philosophical, what makes our thinking and questioning philosophical? We can provide some kind of like preliminary or naive definitions right out the gates to what the love of wisdom means, where love is, like, these are just to provide some definitions to kind of take a leap off of in a moment, a ladder to kick away. So just some definitions of love are like affection or infatuation or just a general caring for somebody or something. And again, just a couple offhand definitions of wisdom or ideas of wisdom would be critical thinking. One's wise if they think critically, or if they know how to appeal to the best theory, or if they know what the best theory is. Wisdom would be some kind of sagely capital T truth, knowing what that is. Or it would be simply something like not getting tricked, knowing how to not be deceived would be wise. So there's some general or simple or naive senses of love and some general, simple, naive senses of wisdom. And if we can smush those together in some sense for ourselves, then we have a kind of basic approach to the phrase, the love of wisdom, that we could use to further unpack its meaning, to further explicate its meaning. And that won't simply be a matter of, like I just suggested, pushing these terms together, love and wisdom, but of seeing how they imply each other, how they're coordinated, uh, what the relationship is between them, uh, how they relate, what this of in some sense is supposed to be. I won't get too much into that, but I think that's partially what's at stake, is understanding what that might mean. But anyway, our pre-understanding served as a basic approach to the term love of wisdom. This means that the phrase itself should be capable of telling us what it means insofar as we find the phrase itself intelligible at all to begin with. So the idea here is that you can start with a kind of basic background pre-understanding of what it is that you already know about the term philosophy. And if you have this naive sense, like we have a naive sense for all kinds of things, you can explicate or unpack or get more and more imminently involved in this naive sense. You can make it not naive by developing this sense. I also want to make a kind of peculiar gesture here because what this suggests to me is that we don't go and ask the philosopher what philosophy is. We don't go and ask the non-philosopher or the pre-philosopher what philosophy is. We can ask philosophy itself what it is, where this very phrase, love of wisdom, this phrase of philosophy, if we have a naive sense for that and we suppose that we can go about developing that phrase, then again, just to be repetitive, we don't need to appeal to anything outside of philosophy to know what philosophy is, to ascertain what philosophy's subject matter is. So just a couple notes here. We can't just define what philosophy is for it in advance. The kind of the odd quip that I missed here a moment ago was, have you asked philosophy itself what it is? We're not going to the philosopher. We want to ask the philosophy itself what it is. And if we suppose that it could answer, then it's in some sense self-defining. It will define and explicate what its own self or what its own meaning is. There are two things to add here, and they're kind of provisional things to mention, where, like, if we suppose that philosophy, the meaning of it can be developed or ascertained, and we don't want to provide a definition too fast, it's precisely because this definition might provide some kind of idea about what philosophy is in advance that doesn't actually align with what philosophy is and does, or precludes what philosophy is and does. So there are paradoxical caveats of if we go too fast to a definition, we might leave out or preclude what philosophy is. So by answering too quickly, by having a preset answer, we might offset or negate this whole attempt to answer or respond to this question of what is philosophy. Likewise, if we go too slowly and merely stick to what is hardly intelligible, this aforementioned naive sense of philosophy, this sense of philosophy that's hardly showing itself at this point, if we went too slowly and didn't attempt to understand that and explicate it, then we would be simply satisfied with our naive pre-understanding of what philosophy is. And in some sense, we would at that point be performatively answering what philosophy is. It would be its unexplicated sense for whoever that person is. I want to say that we should be suspicious of both of these, giving a definition too fast and not really entertaining a definition. I've got a couple ideas of characters here who might do this sort of thing, or who might provide a definition too quickly, or who might not provide a definition and pay certain consequences for that. And the characters that I have in mind are sophists, who just they'll tell you what wisdom is, or they know what wisdom is. They have their definition set out in advance, or is just the general caricature that we could paint. There's also a kind of a person who is dogmatically allied in science. The scientism is what that's called, where they say that instrumental reason, or whatever knowledge that my instruments yield, is what knowledge is, or sorry, is what wisdom is. And in that sense, they perhaps preclude what wisdom actually is by suggesting that they know that it's actually instrumental knowledge. There are also the slow movers, like the pre-initiated, who are satisfied with their wake-a-day ideas of what philosophy is, of old science or debunked science, or nobody does philosophy. We know it's useless. We know it's useless now. The pre-initiated, or the disparagers, so like skeptics, or kind of a character who would say, we know that knowledge, or we know that wisdom can't be attained. The sophist, the scientism person, the disparager, and the pre-initiated, they all fail to hear philosophy answering for itself, in that aforementioned sense of letting it try to answer itself, speak for itself. Let it come out of hardly showing itself in this naive sense to be more fully explicated. They fail to let it do that if they're not participating with it charitably in some sense. There are other problems to this taking the naive approach for granted, where if we merely provide a definition and then go looking for instances of philosophy, it will only find instances that fit the definition that we set out in advance. So again, that's that problem of precluding what philosophy might be if we start with the definition. There are also problems with this being ad hoc. So for example, we can ask, how and for what reason or end did you provide an answer or definition to what philosophy is at this point? What method did you utilize in order to know what philosophy was, such that you could provide a definition? And is this means that you took to philosophy meta-philosophy, such that you can like act on philosophy as an object and know what it is, or is it some kind of non or extra philosophical method of some sort that tells you from the outside what philosophy is? Some kind of, like, the ad hoc definitional approach is just like this kind of shot from nowhere, third person, without any further justification, just laying out what the love of wisdom is supposed to imply. And because this is done in this just aforementioned shotgun style way, the definitions fail to account for how they came to be definitions at all, how they came to be taken up or called into question as pertaining to a certain kind of philosophical question, that aforementioned doing philosophy that we want to know about, that would qualify the question, what is philosophy, would tell us what its subject matter is. I think I can move on. So at this point in trying to answer the question of what is philosophy, we have these naive definitions and problems surrounding attempting to either take them for granted or attempting to not provide them. So there are some peculiar imperatives here where we want to avoid providing a definition in advance, but also we don't want to stick to this mere naive sense. We want to develop this naive sense of philosophy, these definitions that I just laid out, and see how they can become more robust and fit together more comprehensively. But right out the gates we're stopped, because recall the definitions of love and wisdom that I just laid out like from a shotgun, where there were several differing notions that We don't know which is the right one in advance. This is the whole problem. There are many definitions suggested at the outsets, or at the outset. Um, Same with love, for that matter. There are different notions of wisdom and love, and we don't know which of them are truly the wisdom and the love that we want to know about, so as to ascertain the subject matter of what the love of wisdom is supposed to mean. The issue here is, how can we tell which of these notions of love and wisdom is the correct one? And how can we even tell if any of them is the correct one? Do we have it defined already? Have we missed it? How would we know when we found it? This is an old problem in philosophy called the Meno's paradox. It's the Meno paradox. It belongs to Meno. Pertains to Meno. Where the whole issue is, how do you recognize in, or as your knowledge, in and as your knowing, the wisdom that you seek to know? How would you recognize when you know what it is that you seek to know? There are two responses here, where I either don't or cannot know what that recognition would entail, so I don't know how to recognize the knowledge that I seek to know, or I can't come to know how to recognize the knowledge that I seek to know. And in this sense, trying to come to know what you seek to know is an unintelligible task if you don't know the criterions under which you would recognize that you've recovered or learned what it was that you sought to know. Another way of putting this is, there's no knowledge of wisdom explicitly. There's no knowing of wisdom explicitly that we could utilize to know when we have identified the true wisdom apart from any kind of partial or non-wisdom. That's a problem. The other avenue of response in this is, you must in some sense already know what it is that you seek to know. You have some kind of tacit pre-understanding of what it is that you seek, and it's a matter of developing what it is that you seek. So this is kind of the avenue that I've been setting us up to follow at this point. If I in some sense already possess in knowledge the meanings of love and wisdom that I seek to know, then it's a matter of recognizing, recollecting, remembering, and recovering this sense explicitly in its fullness. I think I'll have more to say about that later, but I want to keep moving on with trying to develop the meaning of love of wisdom. Because at this point we just want to say, well, we have this kind of naive pre-understanding that fits the criterion of the Meno paradox, that we just need to recover out of our pre-understanding what a fuller, more explicit sense of love of wisdom actually means. So at this point we have a dim sense, a hardly revealed sense of love of wisdom as a whole term. We don't know what wisdom is. Which one of these wisdoms is the right one? We don't know which one of these loves is the right one. Not only because we refuse to define in advance which is the right one, and also because we refuse to simply take any of these naive senses for granted, but importantly, moving on now, but because the phrase love of, in love of wisdom, itself does not entail that we can even come to know what wisdom is. We don't know what the right love of is at this in this qualified sense of the whole term. So what is this love of part of wisdom supposed to mean if we don't immediately qualify this as like wisdom of wisdom, or the possession of wisdom, or the achievement of wisdom? Why is philosophy qualified as love of wisdom as opposed to any of these other particular ones? What I want to suggest is that, like, continuing to try to situate us down following this line of thought, where like this was like this for me anyway when I prepared this, where it's like a moment of looking at the back of your head, because it seems that this is exactly the situation that we're in right now, trying to kind of plumb out this line of thought. Uh, if I'm right now in this very moment not sure of what the wisdom is that I seek, then I'm in this position of not possessing it, not having it achieved, merely being in this vague or dim love of wisdom, where I'm still trying to qualify what love and wisdom actually are. So there's a kind of gestalt that can be had here where if this is my exact situation, uh, then love of is in some sense telling us the love of wisdom is in some sense telling us the very position that we're in when we are seeking what it is that wisdom means. Our very situation at this moment in thought is in the position of love of, if we don't know what wisdom is, and if we are still struggling to ascertain what the definitions of love and wisdom are. We are in the position of the Meno paradox, wherein we are questioning and relating to the love of wisdom, and wisdom is shown to be that kind of blank X that we still seek to know. If we're in the position of love of as this vague approach to wisdom that isn't its achievement or possession yet, then we know our situation, we know our approach, we just need to ascertain what the meaning of this blank X is from the position of our love of. So love of wisdom, love of, is in the position of an attempt at a possible recovery of realizing a deeper meaning of wisdom. Recall that if I can only ever recover a sense of wisdom from what it is that I already understand, then there's no outside of wisdom. There's no outside of love of that I have to appeal to. We're approaching some dire consequences here, because this is okay, this is fine. If the phrase love of wisdom leaves wisdom as this kind of variable blank X at this point, where even love of in the phrase love of wisdom doesn't guarantee that we could ever even come to know what wisdom is, then we're rightly situated in and as philosophy in the situation of love of, and that's our background disposition in a more robust sense now. So what I mean here is we're kind of stepping over our naive definitions of love and wisdom that we provided from the outset. And what I'm suggesting here is that we are in this very position of being lovers of, but not yet knowing what love and wisdom are. And it's fine that we can't appeal to anything outside of wisdom, because the idea here is that wisdom is going to be the meaning that you recover from what it is that you already know. And if you're in the situation of being of love of, then you already know what love of is. So the idea here is that you know your situation as being in the love of wisdom. And if you're trying to know what wisdom is, and you only have access to what it is that you already know, then the idea here is if the search is still intelligible, then wisdom is in some sense to be found in love itself. This is fine. This carries a set of beautiful implications that get a little catchphrasy here at certain points, because if we are at this point in questioning the meaning of the love of wisdom, and our very situation is to be in this dim or vague love of, and wisdom is supposed to, according to the Meno paradox, already in some sense be meaningful to me, then I must, in the being of my love of, already contain this kind of wisdom, albeit tacitly or implicitly. The love of wisdom has spoken. There are three things that just attempting to qualify the term itself imminently tells us about how to continue going about loving wisdom and qualifying what loving wisdom actually is, how to go about qualifying what it is that we're even doing. So there are three things. The love of wisdom announces its situation. It tells us in some sense where you are, as this kind of dim background sense of what wisdom might be. It also tells you the means by which to seek it, where your very situation as a lover of wisdom is also the methodology that you take towards seeking what wisdom is, where if there's already a tacit sense of wisdom in my background understanding of love of, then it's just a matter of unpacking my background understanding as the means to as the means towards finding love. And in this sense, it also tells us where to find it, where to find wisdom. It's to be found by more wholly explicating what love is. So the love of wisdom by itself as a phrase tells us our situation, our methodology, and our goal. And it's just a matter of continuing this line of thought towards more fully explicating what the love of wisdom implies. Another catchphrase here is, in my love of must already exist the wisdom that I seek. There are three things that we can say about these implications at this point. If this model or this line of thinking holds, then the first thing that we can say is that the true subject matter of this seeking, this questioning of the meaning of the love of wisdom, the meaning or the subject matter of philosophy, the true subject matter of this seeking is love, where when we wholly understand what love is, when it's wholly explicated, if wisdom is in some sense in my background understanding from the point of view of loving it, then it's a matter of explicating wholly this background understanding, and wisdom will have been yielded in some sense along the way. And I'll have more to say about that in a moment. But we could say it in this way as well. It's not just that the true subject matter of this seeking is love, but we could say that it's the true subject matter of this seeking is wisdom in the being of love, or wisdom via love. So it's not that we're questioning wisdom qua wisdom, where it's wisdom as it is in itself. We're not asking that. The methodology applied thus far hasn't approached or even thought of something like that. It's thinking of wisdom in the being of love, where wisdom is in love in some sense, inside of love in some sense, and I guess in love if it could be fully explicated. Anyway, another implication here to take stock of is this model is taking recognition seriously, this moment of knowing and thinking that recalls and recognizes. So one of the things that the Meno paradox gets right is that it frames recognition in terms of what it is that one already understands. So if I can come to know it, wisdom, then I already in some sense know it, is the kind of lesson in the Meno paradox. And it's a matter of recognizing it and realizing that I already know it. Knowledge, just as an aside, is in this model not merely about something like corresponding to objects, but is about being able to relate to oneself in a new way, where I don't have to go outside of myself and what it is that I already know in order to know. As another aside, do philosophers anywhere approach what they do or their subject matter in this way? Do philosophers today seek wisdom by attempting to know love? Do they know what love is? Because they're supposed to. If this model is intelligible or if it holds, then it's not that the lover of wisdom goes out seeking this wisdom, not knowing wholly what it is in advance, without ever having to qualify their love. If they're thinking and attempting to let the term speak for itself, then the subject matter of philosophy isn't about seeking this kind of capital W wisdom, but of explicating it out of what it is that one already understands in the being of love. So again, it tells us our situation, it tells us the means by which to seek, and it tells us where to look. All of this is there in the term itself. All of that has been spoken out of the term itself. Just as a kind of slight jab, philosophizing without love conceived in this sense, without having taken the Meno paradox seriously in terms of recognizing and recovering and recollecting, philosophy is just kind of like this empty and unqualified wisdom, where it remains at the level of providing these kind of mere definitions that we could just, like a shotgun, provide in advance and just spray many different ideas of what wisdom or love are. Unqualified wisdom is a wisdom that hasn't been mediated by its very approach. Unqualified wisdom is the wisdom that hasn't been understood as being imminently accessible in the very approach that one takes to wisdom itself. I've got Ramana Maharshi and Hegel in mind here, where they both have little bits to say about kind of the equivocation and approximation of one's method to what it is that one seeks to know. If method is different or incomplete or incompatible or discontinuous from its subject matter and goal, then how could the subject matter or goal be ascertained or achieved? The idea here is that your method, in some sense, is what yields your goal, your truth. And this isn't meant merely in the kind of the answer is there in the question. It's meant a little more generally in the sense of what is sought is implicit to how one seeks it. And in the domain of philosophy, one's very approach of love of must be recognized to be what one seeks in some sense. So love of as this dim starting point of one's situation, wanting to get to wisdom in some sense, that very love of in its explicated fullness would be, is supposed to be, would yield wisdom in some sense. So there's another imperative here moving forward, developing this meaning, where there's a kind of imperative to align one's method with one's subject matter. And we've achieved that here already. That is, we've undergone a recovery and qualified what the phrase love of wisdom's subject matter is. So we can say our method is the love of, and our subject matter is love in the form of wisdom, or love qua wisdom, or love in the being of wisdom. We will know wisdom when we know what love is. Wisdom is knowing what love is. So there's some avenues or subtleties in interpretation here where it's not quite clear how the methodology is supposed to yield wisdom at this point, because we can say wisdom is this path from love to wisdom, insofar as it's like this kind of you're explicating wholly what love is. It's the path in between. So wisdom would be the means that one takes to get to the end of the path. But it could also be the product at the end of the path, where once you fully explicated love, you don't have wisdom until it's fully explicated. So part of the avenues of interpretation for love of wisdom, or just wisdom in general at this point, is it's a path and or a product of some kind. And the task of attempting to develop this meaning or further recover this meaning is that we have to explicate wholly what love is, where if we explicate wholly our situation, supposing that the merely intelligible, merely naive sense of wisdom that we have from the point of view of that situation is in some sense tacit in that situation, then our task is just a matter of explicating wholly what love itself is. And it will therefore yield wisdom either along the way or as the product of the fully explicated notion of love. Another avenue or subtlety in interpretation is that one of the ways that we can attempt to understand love and wisdom at this point, if it is that we can suggest that wisdom is imminently involved in love in some sense. Another way to understand this is that they are equivalent on some level, that what we're attempting to undergo here is seeking to recognize that love and wisdom are the same, but this path that we have to take is understanding that they appear to be distinct and how and why it is that they appear to be distinct. So in this different interpretation or the subtlety, it would be that love and wisdom are in some sense the same, and the nature of this path is demonstrating their equivocation. Another possible avenue or subtlety in interpretation is that love is the unexplicated or unappropriated form of wisdom. So as opposed to unpacking wisdom out of love, it's that love was actually wisdom the whole time, and it's just love is just what wisdom looks like when it's unexplicated or unappropriated. So those are some subtleties and interpretations, some possible avenues to continue taking down this way. And we don't really have to wholly land on any one of them at this point, and one can just kind of continue on with them in one's pocket, in a sense, I suppose. But because we don't have to land on any one of these final interpretations at this point anyway, because what's important is this sense of full explication that we've yielded as a kind of standard for what would meet these conditions of being a path or a product or an equivocation, because it's this full sense that we want to understand more comprehensively at this point. Without that, how could we go about qualifying any of these particular avenues? A full explication of love, whatever that means, insofar as we understand wisdom as the path, the product, or equivalent to love or wisdom. I forgot which one I just said. Sorry, I've lost my place. I think I could just continue on at this point anyway, because I'm just going to speak a little bit about what this full explication is supposed to mean. First, in hindsight, speaking again to the merely naive or undeveloped sense, because I think that there's a little bit more to say about that merely definitional approach at this point. A merely definitional approach that would have given us a definition of love or wisdom in advance without undergoing this developmental recovery that I'm attempting to demonstrate, like I suggested, would have only found what I put here to begin with, would have potentially excluded some notions of wisdom, and therefore would have made recognizing the true wisdom an unintelligible task of some sort, because, like I suggested, it can't take account of how its terms came to be developed, and what it is that we're attempting to undergo at this point is a full explication, a full development of the meaning of love, so as to flesh out or yield this wisdom that's supposedly inherent or in love in some sense. So to push forward with this sense of full explication, we could say, or we could suppose that we would fail to recover philosophy's subject matter if we unwittingly excluded the truth, because we didn't first recover a sense by which we could recognize it. So only by taking this developmental path of attempting to fully explicate love of wisdom by seeing what wisdom is in love would we be able to first develop this sense of love of wisdom as a whole, so that when it exists as a whole, that is continuous with our recognition of it. So it's imperative at this point to think of love of, in the phrase love of wisdom, as inclusively as possible. So trying to sidestep the problems with the mere definitional approach that was by all accounts exclusive and made the attempt to understand love of wisdom impossible or unintelligible. Uh, there's another imperative here to try to think of in as inclusively of a possible sense. Sorry, as inclusively as possible. Um, this is our now qualified sense of love. So again, we haven't gone outside of the whole phrase at all, and by tracing out kind of these contours of meaning between love and wisdom, um, we've qualified this a sense of love, where now we can say love is a more robust sense than this mere affectionate love or this mere care that we set out in the definitions to begin with. But the kind of love that we set up as an imperative, as a theoretical imperative at this point in developing the meaning, is that it's got to be a wholly inclusive kind of love. If we want a full explication of love, then love needs to be wholly inclusive in order to be fully explicated. If a love is exclusive, then there are members that are left out and therefore can't be fully explicated as part of the meaning of love. So a kind of all-inclusive love is the kind of love that we want to consider as approaching wisdom now at this point. Is this a universal or vague love? I don't think so. We could say, to borrow terms, that there's a kind of concrete universal, a love that is all-inclusive in a universal sense of being all-inclusive, but that actually exists, that isn't this kind of all-inclusive abstraction that has a dim recollection of what wisdom would imply. There's a concrete, formal accomplishment of love in this universal sense. And I'm approaching these kind of loose ends that I'm going to be leaving off on. And I don't want to say too much about it because I'll just wind up talking and winding up in my own dead ends, trying to piece it together for myself on the spot. But what I want to say as approaching one of these loose ends is forgiveness. The act of forgiveness is a concrete universal, is a phenomenological instance of an all-inclusive kind of gesture. And because it's all-inclusive, because anybody could forgive anybody about anything, logically speaking. I know it's not like that in application, but logically speaking, forgiveness fits the bill for this kind of all-inclusive act that one could do in and by for everybody. I want to qualify forgiveness as a phenomenological mutual recognition of selves that can be performed by any and all. So this kind of all-inclusive love that we're called to think in terms of as an imperative yields the idea that of forgiveness. We could use forgiveness to fit this bill. It's important, though, to mention that this isn't about mastering forgiveness. So it's like, okay, we want this full explication of love and wisdom, and we've yielded love in the form of forgiveness. So if we want to know what wisdom is, then we just need to fully explicate, fully master, fully understand forgiveness so that we're forgiving everybody all the time, something like that. That's not at all what's at stake. What's important is that forgiveness serves as a material instance of something that was supposedly merely an abstract dead end in thought, where I wound up in this place of needing to qualify an all-inclusive love of some sort, an all-inclusive activity, where people could recognize each other or at least be included in this definition of love so as to be participant to this full explication. I lost my place. To continue, there's no need to master forgiveness or do this all the time in this kind of highfalutin sense. Right, yeah, that it was a material instance. What's important is that forgiveness was a material instance, a concrete affect of thought, the platform that we can see in our own life that is now recovering a deeper meaning. where forgiveness has come on the scene as something that we all tacitly kind of already understand in the background, but now it's coming on the scene here as part of a philosophical explication and attaining some kind of higher meaning, where before forgiveness might just be a model of how to apologize between a couple or more people, but it is at this point developing a deeper meaning where it fits the bill for being this kind of all-inclusive gaze that once everybody is included by understanding forgiveness in some sense, forgiveness itself could undergo this full explication, as once we've fully explicated forgiveness, we've fully explicated love, and wisdom will be yielded either as the path or the product, or as the equivocation of all these terms. At this point, I could say in closing that in framing love as forgiveness, that love of, in the phrase love of wisdom, is a moral mutual recognition, where forgiveness is a kind of moral behavior, and that what we're getting at now with questioning love is a kind of moral activity. And we could just plug in the terms almost at this point, where we say the love of wisdom, filling in now these terms that we've qualified and developed. The love of wisdom is the all-inclusive mutual recognition of a fully explicated mutual recognition, where love, like I suggested, is that all-inclusive mutual recognition, and wisdom would be the fully explicated version of that mutual recognition. So just to say that again, it was neat and formulaic. The love of wisdom has been qualified as the all-inclusive mutual recognition of a fully explicated mutual recognition. And to continue on this path would be to take up the loose end of fully explicating the meaning of an all-inclusive mutual recognition, where we will develop more of what wisdom is by explicating and understanding more of what this all-inclusive mutual recognition is, this supposedly moral or loving category. Or in other words, what this approach might entail is that there's a need or a means or a calling to close this gap between the differences in qualification at this point, where love is qualified as all-inclusive and wisdom is qualified as fully explicated. How do we close the gap between all-inclusive mutual recognition and fully explicated mutual recognition? What does that question even mean? What would that even look like? What are the ramifications of the existence of forgiveness in this sense, is another loose end to leave off on. If this line of thought is intelligible, then its accomplishment or answering and traversing would be wisdom. So that kind of just goes back to what I was saying about the path, the product, and the equivocation. Supposedly, if wisdom was tacitly on the scene all along, then we know it's going to be, in some hazy sense anyway, we know that it will be there in the beginning, there along the path, there as the product, and there as all of these things. And it's just a matter of continuing along the line of developing these meanings and attempting to understand how it could be all of those things, but in a more fully explicated way, in an all-inclusive way, in a way that's not dim. To close now on a stolen line, if the end of this task of answering the question, what is philosophy, if that could actually come to a kind of closure, a kind of answering, then one would have wisdom. Love of wisdom, if one could fully explicate that all-inclusive love, then they would have wisdom. They would be wisdom. Their activity would be wise. And in this sense, what would they have wisdom of? They would have wisdom of love. So without saying how to get there or how we get there, just because there's not quite enough time to continue unpacking what the implications of forgiveness are and all these loose ends. If the task is intelligible and if it could be accomplished, then what it is that one has wisdom of when they reach the end of philosophy in some sense is love. And one could say that the subject matter of the love of wisdom is, therefore, a wisdom of love.